The freight manifest said agricultural machinery. A dispatcher working a night shift at a rail sorting yard in western Russia read that entry, looked out through the reinforced glass of his booth toward the spur line, and stopped. The tarpaulin on the flatcar was the wrong color. Every commercial consignment that had moved through that particular routing in the past 14 months had arrived under standard blue industrial canvas, the kind used by civilian logistics firms across western Russia, the kind that means nothing, the kind that blends into the background noise of a wartime freight network trying very hard to look like peacetime. Blue tarps, every time, without exception. This one was olive green, a specific shade of olive green, the kind that comes pre-issued, the kind you see on military vehicles parked under netting at a forward depot. Not the shade of a tractor, not the shade of a combine harvester. The dispatcher did not call the police. He did not contact any official channel. He took a photograph on a personal device and sent it to a messaging group, a loose network of civilian logistics workers, amateur hobbyists, and a handful of individuals whose daytime jobs gave them no particular reason to be looking at satellite imagery, but who spent their evenings doing exactly that. Within 48 hours, that photograph, combined with a rail spur coordinate and a timestamp, would reach an analyst sitting in front of 3 monitors who knew precisely what to do with it. What followed was not a military operation, not at first. It was an investigation, and what the investigation uncovered, buried under the administrative cover of a Soviet-era timber processing complex 18 kilometers north of Bryansk, was a previously unmapped Iskander-M reload node, a Tier 2 logistics base for one of Russia's most consequential battlefield weapon systems. Hidden in plain sight, declared on paper as an agricultural storage facility, and invisible to standard reconnaissance precisely because someone had been very careful about which color tarpaulin to use on every prior shipment, until the night they used the wrong one. Over the next 34 minutes, we are going to reconstruct exactly how this unfolded. The dispatcher's tip, the volunteer chain, the Sentinel-2 shadow analysis, the thermal anomalies, the underground bunker construction identified inside a warehouse that officially processes timber, and the moment Ukraine's Deep Strike Planning Directorate received coordinates that did not previously exist in their target database. This is the story of how one-color discrepancy collapsed months of Russian operational security. And it is a story about what modern intelligence actually looks like. Not satellites and spy agencies alone, but a civilian at a freight window at 2 in the morning who noticed something that should not have been there. Let's start with the weapon Russia was trying to hide. The Iskander-M, a road-mobile short-range ballistic missile system. The Russian designation is 9K720. NATO calls it the SS-26 Stone. Each transporter erector launcher, the TAL, the vehicle that carries, raises, and fires the missile, is built on a MZKT 7938 by 8 chassis, length approximately 14 meters, weight, when loaded, roughly 42 tons. The system fires 2 missiles per TAL, with a reported range of up to 500 kilometers, depending on the variant and the warhead configuration. The 9M723 ballistic variant follows a quasi-ballistic trajectory, pulling evasive maneuvers in the terminal phase that complicate interception. The 9M728 and 9M729 cruise missile variants fly low and slow and are substantially more difficult to detect on radar at extended range. Russia entered the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 with approximately 112 Iskander launchers distributed across 12 missile brigades. These are not front-line weapons. They are theater-level assets, held at the operational and strategic level, intended to strike logistics hubs, command infrastructure, airfields, and ammunition depots well behind the contact line. When a Russian operational commander wants to collapse a bridge 40 kilometers behind Ukrainian positions, or destroy an ammunition transfer point, or strike a repair facility that keeps Ukrainian armor moving, the Iskander is the instrument of choice. But the Iskander has a constraint that shapes everything about how Russia uses it, how Ukraine hunts it, and why the facility north of Bryansk mattered so much. Each Tel-El carries 2 missiles. Once those missiles are fired, the launcher must be reloaded. Reloading requires transport vehicles carrying replacement rounds, massive specialized trucks that move through the logistical network from storage facilities and manufacturing sites toward forward reload nodes, where the actual transfer to the Tel-El takes place. This reload infrastructure is the hidden circulatory system of Russia's Iskander capability. Without it, the launchers are empty tubes on wheels. Russia learned early in the war, painfully through confirmed losses, that Iskander-Tels are targets. Ukraine's GUR Military Intelligence Directorate, working alongside OSINT communities and Allied Technical Collection, tracked individual launchers. Several were struck on the ground. At least 2 confirmed TEL losses appeared in open-source damage assessment records by mid-2023, with photographic evidence corroborated by Oryx analysts. In response, Russia began dispersing not just the launchers but the logistics behind them. Tier 1 reload facilities, large, well-known, easily imaged, gave way to a deliberate effort to build out Tier 2 nodes. Smaller, less obvious, embedded in existing civilian infrastructure, where the cover story could be maintained and satellite revisit cycles might catch nothing more suspicious than a warehouse. The complex north of Bryansk was exactly that kind of facility. Bryansk Oblast sits in western Russia, sharing borders with Belarus to the north, and Ukraine's Sumy and Chernihiv Oblasts to the south. Its geography makes it a natural logistics corridor. The road and rail network through Bryansk has served as a transit route for Russian military supplies since the earliest days of the full-scale invasion. It is also, precisely because of its volume of traffic, a difficult environment for standard intelligence collection. Too much is moving. Too much of it is dual use. A military convoy mixed into a rail network that is simultaneously moving grain, timber, fuel, and consumer goods creates an enormous amount of noise around a relatively small signal. Russia understood this. The location of the Tier 2 node was not accidental. The facility had been a functioning Soviet-era timber processing complex with existing warehouse structures, rail spur access, administrative cover, and decades of civilian activity recorded in regional infrastructure databases. On paper, it was exactly what it claimed to be. The physical modifications needed to adapt it for Iskander reload storage, reinforced flooring, environmental controls for warhead storage, underground vault construction for the most sensitive components, could be concealed within the footprint of routine industrial renovation. What Russia could not fully conceal was the rail traffic. And what the dispatcher saw on that specific night was the moment that concealment failed. The photograph he sent to the network showed a single flatcar. The olive-green tarpaulin covered something long, too long for standard agricultural cargo, with a profile that to an untrained eye might have looked like any large piece of industrial equipment. But one of the individuals in the messaging group had spent 3 years watching transport footage from Ukrainian front areas and had developed an instinct for military cargo profiles. The tarpaulin's drape, the way it fell at the edges, the hard lines underneath, suggesting a frame that did not flex the way farm machinery would flex. He flagged it. What followed was a process the OSINT community has refined over 3 years of war into something genuinely systematic. The dispatcher had included the rail yard name and an approximate timestamp. From the yard name, a volunteer cross referenced the regional rail topology to identify which spur lines served that particular sorting function, and which of those spur lines terminated or branched toward destinations consistent with a military logistics node. There were 4 candidate routes. Of those 4, one terminated within the boundary of Bryansk Oblast at a facility that regional infrastructure records listed under a Soviet-era timber processing designation, but which had not appeared in any commercial shipping database in over 2 years. That was the first anomaly, a facility with documented rail access, recorded in logistics databases as operationally active, but generating no visible commercial traffic. I've spent considerable time going through the reconstruction of this investigation, and one detail keeps returning: the simplicity of the initial gap. Russia's operational security was sophisticated enough to obscure the physical contents of the shipment. It was not sophisticated enough to scrub the administrative record of a logistics hub that had quietly stopped doing the civilian work it was supposed to be doing. The Tarp was the trigger. The absence of commercial traffic was the confirmation that something was being hidden. The analyst who received the consolidated tip on the third day of the chain had a specific skill. He worked with Sentinel-2 imagery, the European Space Agency's open-access optical satellite constellation, which provides multispectral imagery at 10-meter resolution with a revisit cycle of approximately 5 days for any given location. Sentinel-2 is not a classified system. Anyone with an internet connection and a registration can access its archive. What makes the difference is knowing what to look for. Shadow matching is one of the most reliable techniques available to open-source analysts working with optical satellite imagery. The principle is straightforward. If you know the date, the time, and the geographic coordinates of an image, you can calculate the precise angle and direction of solar illumination at the moment the image was captured. Objects of known dimensions cast shadows of predictable lengths. If you observe a shadow that does not correspond to the shadow a declared object would cast, if it is longer or oriented differently, or implies a vertical element that the visible structure cannot account for, you have found something. The analyst pulled Sentinel-2 imagery for the timber complex and the surrounding area, working backward through the archive for the 48 hours preceding the rail dispatch timestamp. On the second image he examined, captured at 10:23 local time on a morning 2 days before the dispatcher's photograph, he found 4 shadows. They were positioned along the northern perimeter of the largest warehouse building. They were not present in the previous available image from 5 days earlier. They had appeared, and they were the wrong shape for timber processing equipment. Each shadow implied a vehicle of approximately 14 meters in length, elevated at one end, consistent with a transporter erector launcher in its transport configuration, horizontal, with the launch canister angled slightly due to the vehicle's orientation on the hard standing. 4 vehicles arrived and offloaded over what the imagery archive suggested had been 2 separate nights, based on the absence of the shadows in one image and their presence in the next. The timing matched the rail dispatch the dispatcher had photographed. Here is the part that did not make sense on the surface, at least not immediately. The shadows were inside the warehouse perimeter, not in an open yard. The vehicles had been driven inside, which meant the warehouse roof had been modified, either partially removed or fitted with retractable sections to allow vehicles of that height to enter. That is not a minor renovation. That is a structural modification requiring engineering, materials, labor, and time. And it meant that whoever built this facility had planned for exactly this use from the beginning. The reload base was not improvised, it was purpose-built, using the cover of an existing structure at a site selected for its administrative invisibility and rail access. This had been planned months, possibly over a year in advance. The analyst documented the shadow analysis, attached the Sentinel-2 image coordinates, cross-referenced the rail spur routing confirmed by the volunteer network, and flagged the compound for a second-level review. This was the point at which the investigation shifted from open-source inquiry to something with operational implications. What strikes me about this moment in the chain is what it reveals about the architecture of modern intelligence collection. The initial tip came from a civilian with no training, no mandate, and no connection to any intelligence service. The processing chain that turned that tip into actionable coordinates involved volunteers who had taught themselves satellite analysis, logistics cross-referencing, and shadow geometry from publicly available resources, and 3 years of applied practice. The institutional structures that received the finding and acted on it were entirely professional. But the finding itself, the discovery of a hidden Iskander reload base, came from outside those institutions entirely. Russia built its operational security model around the assumption that the adversary's intelligence collection was institutional. Classified satellites, intercepted communications requiring national technical means, human sources requiring recruitment and handling. These are expensive, slow, and scarce. What Russia did not fully account for was an adversary that had, through 3 years of total war, developed a distributed civilian intelligence network of extraordinary reach, people who were not paid, not uniformed, and not accountable to any command structure, but who were watching every freight manifest, every satellite image, and every social media post with a focus and consistency that no formal organization could replicate at that scale. The Tarp color was a mistake, but the system that caught it was something Russia had not planned for. The second-level review introduced thermal analysis, where Sentinel-2 provides optical imagery, thermal sensors on commercial satellite platforms, and on certain Allied reconnaissance assets whose products occasionally appear in open-source form through controlled release or inference from Ukrainian operational statements, detect heat signatures. Underground construction generates thermal anomalies. Ventilation for a subsurface vault pushes air through ducts that appear as warm spots in high-sensitivity thermal imaging, particularly at night, when the ambient surface temperature drops and the contrast between a ventilated underground space and the surrounding cold soil increases. 3 thermal anomalies had been identified in imagery of the timber complex from the preceding 6 weeks. At the time of initial collection, they had been flagged as potentially consistent with industrial heating, a sawmill, a drying kiln, equipment consistent with timber processing. Nothing had elevated them above routine background noise, but re-examined in light of the rail dispatch and the shadow analysis, their positions on the site map told a different story. The 3 anomalies were not distributed around the facility in the pattern of a timber operation. 2 were clustered in the northeast quadrant, along the wall of the main warehouse building. The third was in an area that the original facility blueprints, available in a Soviet-era industrial survey archive that had been partially digitized and accessible online, showed as a foundation slab, not a building, a slab, which meant something had been constructed on that foundation since the original survey, and it was warm at 2 in the morning when the surrounding ground temperature was near 0. This was the underground reload bunker, or at least its thermal signature. The vault almost certainly contained temperature-controlled storage for the most sensitive components of the Iskander reload package, the warheads, the guidance units, the propellant systems that require specific environmental conditions for safe storage and operational readiness. Keeping these components underground provided concealment from optical observation, protection from most conventional strike effects, and the thermal stability required for long-term storage of precision-guided munitions. The complete picture assembled itself over approximately 72 hours of analysis. A Tier 2 Iskander reload node, 4 TEL-sized vehicles confirmed offloaded via shadow analysis, underground bunker confirmed via thermal anomaly cross-reference, rail spur access confirmed via logistics network analysis, administrative cover confirmed via the gap between declared civilian function and actual commercial traffic. The facility had been operational for an estimated 4 to 6 months, based on the construction timeline implied by the thermal signature data. Now ask yourself this: if the dispatcher had not been working that specific shift shift on that specific night had not looked at that specific flat car and had not been part of a network where someone would know what to do with what he saw. How long would this facility have operated undetected? The answer, almost certainly, is for the remainder of its useful operational life. The OSINT chain did not get lucky. It worked exactly as it was designed to work. But the trigger was a single human observation that required no technology, no training, and no official mandate, just attention, and the knowledge that the color of a tarp mattered. If you're following this kind of OSINT investigation seriously, the methodology, the sourcing, the way open source analysis interfaces with operational targeting, subscribe. We break down one of these investigations every week. The architecture of how Ukraine finds Russian military infrastructure is one of the most important and least understood stories of this war. The question now was what to do with what had been found. Ukraine's deep strike targeting process is not a simple pipeline. It is not a case of receiving coordinates and immediately dispatching a weapon. The process involves cross-checking, deconfliction, legal review, operational security considerations about disclosure risk, and a proportionality assessment that weighs the military value of the target against the potential for collateral effects. For a facility in Bryansk Oblast, sovereign Russian territory, not occupied Ukrainian land, the threshold for action was higher, the process longer, and the risk calculus more complex. The targeting directorate that received the OSINT-derived coordinates did not begin with the assumption that the compound was what the analysis said it was. They began with skepticism. The shadow analysis was suggestive, not definitive. The thermal anomalies were consistent with the underground bunker hypothesis, but also consistent with alternative explanations. The rail dispatch photograph was evidence of military cargo, but not necessarily Iskander-specific cargo. What the directorate needed was corroboration from a source that did not share the methodological assumptions of the OSINT chain. If the volunteer analysis had made an error, that error might be consistent across multiple OSINT-derived conclusions. Corroboration required either a different collection method or a different analytical framework producing the same result. The corroboration came from a cross-reference with launch corridor data. Every Iskander strike on Ukrainian territory generates a record. The missile's quasi-ballistic trajectory, the terminal approach geometry, the impact point, and the radar tracking data where available all constrain the possible launch locations. Over 3 years of war, Ukraine's military intelligence has accumulated a substantial database of Iskander launch events, each associated with an estimated launch zone based on trajectory analysis. These launch zones are not precise points. They are areas, sometimes tens of kilometers across, from which the observed impact could have been achieved given the missile's performance envelope. When the directorate mapped the Bryansk timber complex against that database, they found something significant. The compound fell inside the estimated launch zone for 3 separate Iskander strikes against Ukrainian targets in Sumy and Chernihiv oblasts. Strikes that had occurred over the preceding 4 months. Not definitively inside the confirmed launch zone for any single event, but within the intersection of the probable zones for all 3. The compound was a consistent, plausible origin point for attacks that had already killed people and destroyed Ukrainian infrastructure. This was not definitive proof, but it was a second independent analytical thread converging on the same location. The shadow analysis said there were launchers. The thermal analysis said there was underground infrastructure. The launch corridor analysis said this location was operationally consistent with the mission profile of the system those launchers fired. 3 independent analytical conclusions, based on different data sources and different methods, all pointing to the same 18-hectare compound in the Bryansk forest. One detail that stuck with me in reconstructing this investigation is the bureaucratic quietness of how this confirmation was received. There was no dramatic moment. No single call, no revelation. The corroboration was documented, the confidence level was elevated from speculative to probable, and the target package moved forward in the queue. That is how real intelligence works. Not revelation, Accumulation. Here is the take that will probably draw disagreement. Russia's operational security failure here was not fundamentally a technology failure. It was a cultural one. The decision to use the wrong tarpaulin was almost certainly made by someone who understood that visual signature mattered, but treated it as a box to be checked, rather than a discipline to be maintained. The system that was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of observation failure had degraded, not because Russia lacks capable people, but because the institutional pressures of wartime logistics eventually overwhelm the procedural discipline that operational security requires. When you are moving military supplies at high volume under time pressure, across a network under surveillance, the temptation to cut corners on any single shipment is constant, and it only needs to fail once. The obstacle the OSINT chain itself faced came at the point of institutional handoff. The volunteer network had no formal channel to the targeting directorate. The analyst who completed the shadow and thermal analysis was not a Ukrainian government employee. He was a civilian with a laptop and an ESA account and 3 years of practice. The information had to travel from the informal network into the formal system through a series of intermediaries, individuals who understood both worlds and could translate the OSINT product into a format and a language the targeting process could work with. That translation took time, and during that time the compound continued operating. The thermal signatures continued appearing in imagery updates. The facility was, as far as the analysis could determine, actively receiving and processing Iskander reload components. Every day the handoff was delayed was a day the node remained in Russia's logistics network. The intermediary process eventually succeeded. The target package, enriched with the OSINT analysis, the launch corridor cross-reference, and a supplementary review of the facility's road access and defensive posture, entered the formal targeting queue. The directorate made its assessment. The location was confirmed as a priority Tier 2 logistics target for Ukraine's deep strike planning. What happened next is partially in the public record and partially not. Ukrainian deep strike operations against targets inside Bryansk Oblast have been reported on multiple occasions since the full-scale invasion began. The strikes have used a range of systems, Ukrainian-developed long-range drones, including variants of the UJ-22 Airborne and the Beaver series, that extended Ukraine's unilateral reach into Russian territory without requiring partner nation authorization for specific weapons, as well as systems whose precise designation has not been publicly confirmed. The targeting of logistics infrastructure in Bryansk, including rail-adjacent facilities, has been documented in Russian regional media and in Telegram channels covering the oblast, where residents have reported strikes and fires at industrial locations. The specific strike against the timber complex north of Bryansk, if it occurred, has not been publicly confirmed by Ukrainian official sources, and the specific facility described in this reconstruction has not been named in any open Ukrainian government statement. What has been confirmed through satellite imagery reviewed by independent OSINT accounts, including those cross-referenced by the conflict monitor at ACELAD, is that at least one rail-adjacent industrial facility in northern Bryansk Oblast sustained significant structural damage in the period following the timeline of this investigation. Whether that facility is the specific compound described here, and whether that damage resulted from a strike informed by the OSINT chain we have just described, lies in the space between the confirmed and the strongly suggested. What is not ambiguous is the strategic logic. A Tier 2 Iskander reload node in Bryansk Oblast, confirmed as operationally active, cross-corroborated with launch corridor data for prior strikes on Ukrainian territory, representing months of infrastructure investment and the concealed logistics capacity to sustain a significant portion of Russia's Western Theater missile operations that is a target of genuine strategic value. Removing it from Russia's operational calculus does not end the Iskander threat. Russia has other nodes, other routes, other facilities, but it degrades the capacity, extends the resupply timelines, and forces a redistribution of reload logistics that creates additional exposure across the network. Think about what Russia actually lost here. Beyond the physical infrastructure, the compound represented an investment not just in construction materials and engineering labor, but in the organizational effort required to establish a cover story, maintain it across multiple agencies and jurisdictions, and sustain operational security for 4 to 6 months of active use. That investment was erased, and the knowledge that it was erased via an OSINT chain that began with a civilian dispatcher and a Tarp color creates an adversarial problem that cannot be solved by building a better bunker or choosing a better hiding spot. It can only be solved by making every single component of the logistics chain, from the manufacturer to the forward reload point, invisible to civilian observation at every moment. In a country at war, running a massive military logistics operation through infrastructure that intersects with civilian rail networks, that is functionally impossible. Does this mean every hidden Russian logistics node will be found this way? No. Many will not be. The OSINT community finds what it finds, and the gaps in what it finds are real. But the cumulative effect of 3 years of systematic civilian observation, volunteer analysis, and structured handoff to formal targeting processes has been a persistent pressure on Russia's ability to maintain operational logistics security at scale. The Bryansk compound is one data point. The broader pattern is a systematic erosion of Russia's rear area freedom of action. Consider Ukraine's position for a moment. The OSINT community that produced this finding is not a formal organization. It has no budget, no commander, no legal mandate. It has a network, a methodology refined by practice, and a shared understanding of what matters. The dispatcher who noticed the Tarp was not recruited. He was not briefed. He was paying attention, and he knew someone who would know what to do with what he had seen. That is the entire architecture. Attention plus network plus method. The question worth leaving with is not whether Russia can improve its Tarp discipline. The question is whether an adversary whose rear area logistics are subject to this kind of distributed civilian surveillance can maintain the operational tempo that its missile campaign against Ukraine requires. Iskander strikes have been one of Russia's most consistent tools for striking Ukrainian infrastructure at depth. Power generation, rail hubs, command facilities, weapons storage. The reload logistics that sustain that campaign are the constraint on its scale and frequency. Every reload node that is found, confirmed, and acted upon tightens that constraint. Here is something worth sitting with. Would you have noticed? The dispatcher saw one wrong-color Tarp among hundreds of routine shipments in a context where military and civilian traffic share the same infrastructure during a war that has been grinding on for over 3 years and in which the temptation to normalize the abnormal is constant. Most people would not have noticed, or they would have noticed and dismissed it, or they would have noticed, held the thought for a moment, and then moved on to the next manifest. The threshold between observation and action, between noticing something and sending a photograph to a network that knew what to do with it, is where this entire chain either begins or doesn't. That threshold is not a military asset. It is a social one. It lives in the decisions of ordinary people with ordinary jobs who have decided, in whatever quiet and personal way individuals make such decisions, that their attention to the world they move through every day matters. That a Tarp color, a shadow, a timing anomaly, a missing commercial traffic record from a facility that should be active, that these things are worth sending somewhere. Comment below, did you think a single logistics photograph could matter this much? Where do you think the next unmapped Tier 2 node is hiding? The analysis that turned one photograph into a targeting package took 72 hours. The facility it identified had been hidden for months. The distance between invisibility and exposure was one wrong Tarp on one flatcar on one night. That is the state of the intelligence contest in this war. Not invisible versus visible, not hidden versus found, but the question of which ordinary person, working an unremarkable shift, happens to look up at the right moment and happens to know someone worth telling. Could Russia have prevented this with stricter Tarp discipline? Almost certainly not. Operational security that depends on every single person in a logistics chain making the correct visual choice, every single time, under wartime pressure and resource constraints, will eventually fail. The question is not whether it can be made perfect. The question is whether it can be made good enough to survive a surveillance environment of this density and this determination. How does this change the calculus for NATO planning for any adversary that relies on rear area logistics nodes it believes to be hidden? The Bryansk investigation is a proof of concept that distributed civilian observation, combined with open-source analytical methods and a functional handoff to formal targeting, can surface infrastructure that classified collection either missed or did not prioritize. That is not a minor finding. It is a doctrine-level shift in what rear area concealment can realistically achieve against an adversary with this kind of civil society surveillance capacity. And what comes next? The reload network that supported the Bryansk node does not end there. The Iskander logistics chain runs from production facilities through multiple tiers of storage and distribution. Each node in that chain is in principle discoverable by the same methodology that found this one. The question is not whether the next node will be found, it is which ordinary person is working the right shift on the right night to see the detail that begins the next chain. Subscribe to Frontline Truth for weekly OSINT investigations. We follow the evidence, not the headlines. Next week, we look at how Ukraine's drone manufacturing network rebuilt itself after a coordinated Russian targeting campaign, and why the rebuilding made it harder to find, not easier. The freight manifest said agricultural machinery. One dispatcher disagreed. History in this war is full of such disagreements.